there, I'm Cassidy Cash. I'm an artist, Shakespeare historian, and host of That Shakespeare Life, the podcast that goes behind the curtain and into the real life and history of William Shakespeare. Here on YouTube, I share snippets from my research and sections from our podcast, all about life in turn of the 17th century, the way that William Shakespeare would have lived it. You'll see snippets from the show, as well as bonus history content I just like looking up and sharing with you, and so much more. If you like the life of William Shakespeare and turn of the 17th century England, then this is the place for you. Today, we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation, covenant theology, and specifically what kind of reaction there was in England and Scotland when James I came to the throne and united the Church of England with the Church of Scotland. We're going to hear from one of our guests that's been on the podcast who is an expert in this part of history. So let's dive in right now on That Shakespeare Life. In the 16th century, the Reformation had just occurred, and Protestants were establishing their belief system. They'd separated from Catholicism, and now they're reading the Bible for themselves, not having to go through a priest. And there were major religious covenants being defined for the Protestant religion, including the two major ones called the Covenant of Grace and the Covenant of Works. Theologians like John Calvin and Robert Pollock and others were instrumental in the acceptance of what was called covenant theology for the 16th century. And these were basically what we believe about the promises of God outlined in the Bible. That's what covenant theology means. There are two major covenants from this period, and they are still here today. This is the foundation of the Protestant religion even now. And one of these is the Covenant of Works, which was a promise that God made to Adam in the Garden of Eden. And he said, Adam, you can have eternal life and a relationship with God if you will obey the rules. And the rules were, don't eat of the fruit that was in the center of the garden. Obey me, don't eat that, and you can have eternal life. Well, Adam didn't keep his end of the deal. Adam breaks the deal and he sins and curses all of mankind because of it. Now, at this point, all of mankind is in need of salvation, and that's where the covenant of grace comes into play. Now, God's offer of eternal salvation, if you keep the rules, is still in place, but Adam broke it, and mankind is separated now from God and unable to fulfill that promise and unable to take hold of that promise that God is offering. So God sends Jesus, and Jesus lives a perfect life and operates as a representative for all of mankind, fulfilling the good works that man and Adam by himself was unable to do. And then he goes on to pay for the sins of Adam by dying on a cross. This lifts the curse from Adam and all of mankind so that an eternal relationship with God becomes possible through Jesus's death and then resurrection. This supernatural event makes it possible for anyone who believes in Jesus to now fulfill the covenant of works through Jesus and have that promise of eternal salvation. This foundation for the Protestant Reformation is the main tenet of Protestantism, and it's the idea of justification by grace through faith. And we see this practice and application of these covenants happening in Shakespeare's lifetime, both in England and Scotland, which are undergoing similar reformations at the same time. Now, when James I becomes king in 1603, these two groups, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, called the Kirk, are now unified under the crown. And these two groups didn't exactly see eye to eye about the specifics of the Protestant religion or about what applying their understanding of the covenant of works and the covenant of grace was supposed to look like. So it was this kind of mismatch of who's going to do it better was a little bit of a conversation they were having. To better understand what was going on in the 17th century between the Church of Scotland and the Church of England when they were trying to come together and operate as together Protestants here under James I, we sat down and spoke with Neil McIntyre. Neil is an expert in covenants in 17th century Scotland, and he comes to speak with us from Glasgow, so he's right in the heart of things as far as understanding this part of history. And here's what he had to say. Hello, Neil. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, thanks for having me.
In 1560, so just 4 years before Shakespeare was born, the Scottish Parliament designated the Kirk as the sole form of religion in Scotland and adopted the Scots Confession, which rejected many Catholic practices. How did this situation go down in England when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England in 1603? Was there a conflict between the Kirk and the Church of England?
Okay, that's quite a complex opening question. I think I would start by maybe summarising the Reformations in England and Scotland, and then maybe talk a bit about the 16th century political context, and then we can fast forward to the Union of Crowns in 1603. To be as brief as I can, Henry VIII of England, he famously breaks from Rome in 1534 and establishes himself as supreme head of the Church of England. However, a reformation is not just an event, but it's a process. So this continues under his son, Edward VI, and Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, until the young Edward's death in 1553, when Henry's daughter Mary becomes queen and then leads a Catholic counter-reformation until her own death in 1558. Mary is succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth, whose church settlement then re-establishes the royal supremacy, restores the Book of Common Prayers, the official liturgy, and produces the 39 Articles. And these become the doctrinal standards of the Church of England. So from 1534, that Anglo-Scottish boundary becomes a confessional border. And this leads to a series of attempts by Henry and then later Somerset to secure a kind of quote-unquote Protestant British Empire by either persuading or coercing the Scots. This policy is picked up again by Elizabeth, whose support of a Protestant Reformation in Scotland is critical to its eventual success. Scotland in the late 1550s is meanwhile ruled by someone known as Mary of Guise, widow of James V and mother to Mary, Queen of Scots. To kind of fast forward, the campaign for reform is led by a group of nobles known as the Lords of the Congregation, and the preacher, spokesperson and propagandist John Knox, and he'd been living in exile in Geneva and later joined with exiled English Protestants at Frankfurt. So basically, legislation is passed by the Scottish Parliament in 1560 that, although officially Protestant, the young Mary, Queen of Scots, is actually deposed in 1567. The Civil War continues to 1573, and the process of reform actually takes several decades to work out in practice. And I think it's crucial to note at this point that while the Reformation in England had been led by its rulers, in Scotland it's been carried out in defiance of the Crown. So with all this in mind, we can come back to your question about 1603, which is when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England and Ireland. So to be brief, James is very keen to unite the separate churches of England and Scotland as part of his wider ambition of achieving uniformity between the kingdoms and ruling as a British emperor, not dissimilar to the way that Henry VIII had wanted to. But the circumstances behind the establishment of the national churches and their quite different kind of trajectories makes this quite tricky. There was also limited support on either side of the border to pursue this type of project. On the one hand, you had particularly zealous or patriotic Protestant Scots believing that their church was, quote unquote, the best reformed in Europe, and the English church was but half reformed, while some church leaders in England were quite concerned with the Presbyterian or perhaps Puritan flavour of the Church of Scotland. So to answer the question, while there wasn't an open conflict between the churches at the turn of the 17th century, their common Protestantism didn't provide the foundations for an especially amicable relationship.
Definitely some disagreements and tension happening between the two groups there. Over all of the changes that are taking place, it makes sense when you think about how complicated everything was at that time.
Absolutely.
Woo, if you feel like that was a mouthful, this was a dense episode of That Shakespeare Life. We covered a massive amount of history in this particular episode. And when we talk with Neil on the podcast, he goes into way more detail. He talks about the religious context of the idea of taking a covenant. He also talks about how the word covenant could be a legal application or even a personal application. It wasn't always a religious term. So he shares with us some of his ideas of what Shakespeare might have meant when Shakespeare uses the word covenant in some of his plays. He also goes on to share some specifics about what gestures and physical ceremony were supposed to happen when associating a covenant, like if someone were actually taking a covenant in a religious or legal standpoint. There was a frou-for-all? No, there's a word, pomp and circumstance. That's the phrase. There was this to-do that people had to do. And there are actually paintings from the 17th century that demonstrate this taking of a covenant. He talks with us about all of these things in our episode that is completely free to listen on CassidyCash.com. You can find it at CassidyCash.com/episode 267. That's CassidyCash.com/EP267. I'm not really sure why I feel like making this motion with my hands tells you more about the website, but that's where you can go. And on that page, you'll find bonus history. So all of the visual content that goes along with what we're talking about in our conversation with Neil is in the show notes. You can see some of these paintings that he talks about. We link to the documents that he talks about. He talks about the negative confession from the 1580s. Which was a major thing in Scotland. He also talks about some other religious documents, and copies of those are linked in the show notes, as well as portraits of some of the theologians that he's talking with us about. And you can also find it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you like to get your podcasts. So if you enjoy this kind of history and diving into the depths of turn of the 17th century England, then you will enjoy this playlist from our show. This is Shakespeare History Tidbits, where I just go off on a tangent and find things I think are interesting about the 17th century and share it with you. And if that's fun, then please subscribe to our show, because I love making friends with other Shakespeare historians who think this kind of history is just as much fun as I do. So if that's you, then click subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.